Sarah looked poor in her old clothes. Rich passengers laughed at her on the plane. They said she was stupid and simple. But when both engines died and everyone screamed, the simple woman stood up. She was Colonel Viper Mitchell, one of America's greatest fighter pilots. Before watching full story, comment below from where are you watching. Also like and subscribe for more stories. Sarah sat in the airport waiting area early in the morning. The sun was just coming up outside the big windows. She wore old blue jeans with a small hole in one knee, a plain gray sweater that had seen better days, and white sneakers that were clean but clearly old. Her brown hair was tied back in a simple ponytail with a plain rubber band. She carried a small worn black backpack and read a paperback book quietly. The airport was busy with people rushing around. Coffee shops were full of travelers getting their morning drinks. Announcements played over the speakers about flights and gates. Children ran around while their parents tried to keep up with heavy bags. Other passengers sat around her in the waiting area. A rich man in an expensive dark blue suit sat nearby. His shoes were shiny and probably cost more than most people make in a week. He talked loudly on his gold phone about big business deals worth millions of dollars. His voice carried across the whole waiting area. A woman with lots of expensive jewelry sat with her teenage daughter. The woman wore a designer dress and carried a purse that cost thousands. Her rings sparkled in the airport lights. She spoke to her daughter about their rich lifestyle, their big house, expensive cars, and trips to Europe. A young college student sat across from Sarah. He had the newest phone and laptop. His clothes had the names of expensive brands on them. He talked loudly to his friend on video chat about his difficult studies at a famous university. He wanted everyone to hear how smart he was. The rich man finished his phone call and looked around the waiting area. His eyes stopped on Sarah. He smiled in a mean way and nudged the person next to him. "Look at her over there," he said loudly enough for others to hear. "She probably works in a factory or cleans other people's houses. I bet she has never been on a plane before in her life." The rich woman heard this and looked over at Sarah. She joined in the conversation. "People like that don't understand our world," she said to her daughter and anyone else listening. "They live very simple lives and do basic jobs that don't need education. She probably saved money for months and months just to buy this cheap ticket. This is probably a big adventure for her." The college student laughed and looked up from his expensive phone. "I'm studying aerospace engineering and rocket science," he announced loudly. "Real science with very hard math and physics. Most people can't understand what I'm learning." She probably didn't even finish high school. Look at her clothes, so simple and plain. Sarah kept reading her book calmly. She didn't look up or say anything back to them. She had heard these kinds of comments many times before in her life. Some people always judge others by how they look or what they wear. She had learned long ago that getting angry or arguing with such people was not worth her time. She turned another page in her book. It was actually a technical manual about aircraft systems, but from far away it looked like a regular novel. Sarah enjoyed reading about new developments in aviation technology during her free time. When the airline worker announced that their flight was ready for boarding, Sarah gathered her small backpack and joined the line. The rich people from the waiting area were also on the same flight. They whispered and pointed at her as they walked toward the plane. On the plane, Sarah found her assigned seat in row 12. It was a middle seat between two men. The rich businessman sat in the window seat on one side of her. The college student sat in the aisle seat on her other side. Both men looked very unhappy when they realized they had to sit next to her for the 3-hour flight. "Oh great," said the student with a loud sigh. "I have to sit next to someone who probably doesn't even know what Wi-Fi is. She's probably never used a computer in her life." The businessman nodded and agreed. "This is terrible. I'm flying to Denver for a $50 million business deal. Very complicated business stuff with international companies. She wouldn't understand any of it even if I tried to explain it." As the plane got ready to take off, the flight attendants went through the safety instructions. They showed how to use seat belts, where the exits were, and what to do if oxygen masks fell down. Most passengers ignored these instructions, but Sarah watched carefully. She knew that safety information could save lives. The passengers around Sarah kept talking over her like she wasn't even there. They talked about their expensive cars, BMW, Mercedes, and Tesla. They talked about their big houses with swimming pools and guest rooms. They discussed their important jobs and how much money they made every year. The businessman bragged about his company. "We make deals worth hundreds of millions," he said loudly. "I have meetings with CEOs and government officials. My decisions affect thousands of workers. It takes real intelligence and education to do what I do." The college student wanted to sound even smarter. Well, I'm studying the most difficult subjects in the world, he said. Advanced physics, calculus, thermodynamics, and aerodynamics. Airplane design, engine systems, flight controls, navigation systems. It takes a genius-level brain to understand this stuff. He looked down at Sarah's book with a mean smile. What are you reading there? A romance story? Some kind of simple love story? That's probably still too complicated for some people. The rich woman from the waiting area was sitting across the aisle. She kept making loud comments for everyone to hear. My husband is a famous doctor, she announced. We have 3 big houses and a boat that's bigger than most people's homes. Some people work simple jobs their whole lives and never see real money or success. They don't know what it's like to have nice things. Her teenage daughter looked embarrassed by her mother's behavior, but didn't say anything. The girl seemed uncomfortable with all the mean comments about other passengers. Sarah stayed completely calm and quiet through all of this. She continued to turn pages in her book and occasionally looked out the small window at the clouds below. She had learned many years ago that trying to prove yourself to mean and judgmental people was a complete waste of time and energy. The flight attendant came by with the drink cart about an hour into the flight. She was a friendly woman named Jenny who smiled at each passenger. The rich man ordered expensive whiskey that cost $20 a glass. The rich woman wanted champagne in a real glass, not plastic. The student asked for imported beer from Germany. When Jenny asked Sarah what she would like to drink, Sarah looked up with a kind smile and said simply, "Just water, please. Thank you very much." This made the other passengers laugh quietly among themselves. "Water?" whispered the businessman to the student. "She probably can't afford to buy anything else. Or maybe she doesn't know that there are other options." The student nodded and whispered back, "Or she's never tried anything good in her life. She probably drinks instant coffee at home and thinks that's fancy. Some people have no taste for the better things in life." The rich woman heard this and added her own comment. "When you don't have money or education, you don't know what you're missing. Water is probably the most expensive drink she usually has." Sarah heard all these comments but continued reading peacefully. She had chosen water because she always stayed hydrated during flights and didn't drink alcohol when she might need to think clearly. But she didn't feel the need to explain her choices to strangers who had already decided what kind of person she was. 2.5 hours into the 3-hour flight, everything changed completely. The plane suddenly started shaking very hard. It felt like a giant hand was grabbing the aircraft and shaking it back and forth. The lights in the cabin went on and off repeatedly. Passengers' drinks spilled everywhere. Bags fell out of the overhead compartments. Then the yellow oxygen masks dropped down from the ceiling above every seat. People started screaming and panicking. Children began crying. Some passengers called out for their families. The pilot's voice came on the speaker system throughout the plane. Captain Rodriguez usually sounded calm and confident, but now his voice was shaky and scared. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We have a serious emergency situation. Both of our engines have stopped working completely. We are losing altitude rapidly. We need to find the nearest airport for an emergency landing. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for a possible crash landing. Everyone remain in your seats with your seat belts fastened tightly." All the passengers completely panicked when they heard this announcement. The rich woman started screaming and hugging her teenage daughter. Both of them were crying. The businessman who had been so confident about his important business deals turned white with fear and started shaking. He kept saying, "Oh no, oh no, oh no," over and over. The college student who had been bragging about understanding airplanes and engineering started crying like a small child. "We're all going to die," he shouted. "The engines are dead. We're going to crash." All his knowledge about aircraft didn't help him stay calm in a real emergency. Other passengers throughout the plane were praying out loud, calling their families on their phones, and some were even writing quick goodbye messages to their loved ones. The sound of crying and scared voices filled the entire aircraft. But Sarah stayed completely calm and quiet. She sat in her seat with perfect posture, breathing slowly and evenly. While everyone around her was panicking, she was thinking clearly about the situation. Her eyes were alert and focused, like she was analyzing the problem and thinking of solutions. Jenny, the head flight attendant, was running toward the front of the plane to help the pilots. She had been trained for emergency situations, but she had never experienced anything this serious. As she hurried past Sarah's row, she suddenly stopped and looked closely at Sarah's face. Jenny noticed something that the other passengers had missed. Sarah wasn't just calm, she looked like someone who had been in dangerous situations before. Her eyes were steady and focused. She wasn't panicking at all. Then Jenny saw something very small pinned to Sarah's worn backpack. It was a tiny military badge that most people wouldn't even notice. Jenny herself had been in the Air Force for 4 years before becoming a flight attendant, so she recognized military insignia when she saw it. Jenny's eyes got very wide as she realized what the badge meant. She looked more carefully at Sarah's face and suddenly remembered something from her military days. "Oh my God," Jenny whispered, leaning down closer to Sarah. Are you Colonel Sarah Mitchell? The pilot they called Viper?" Sarah looked up at Jenny calmly and nodded once. "Yes, I am." Jenny immediately stood up straight like a soldier at attention, even though the plane was shaking and in serious danger. "Colonel, I was in the Air Force before I became a flight attendant. I served at Ramstein Air Base in Germany. Everyone knew about you. You're famous throughout the entire military. You're a legend. You're a real hero." The passengers sitting around them heard this conversation and stopped crying for a moment. They looked confused and scared. The businessman, still terrified, looked back and forth between Jenny and Sarah. "What's going on here? Who is she? Why are you calling her Colonel?" Jenny's voice was full of respect and hope. "Sir, this is Colonel Sarah Viper Mitchell. She's one of the greatest fighter pilots who ever lived. She flew over 200 dangerous combat missions in Iraq and Afghanistan. She saved countless lives and never lost a single pilot under her command." The atmosphere in that section of the plane changed immediately. Sarah slowly stood up from her middle seat. The quiet, simple woman in plain clothes was completely gone. Now she looked like a confident military officer with steel in her eyes and command presence that filled the space around her. "Jenny," Sarah said in a clear, strong voice that cut through all the panic and noise. "What exactly is wrong with this aircraft?" "Ma'am, both engines are completely dead. The pilots are trying everything they know to restart them, but nothing is working. We're losing altitude fast. According to the instruments, we have maybe 10 minutes before we hit the ground." Sarah nodded once, processing this information quickly. "Take me to the cockpit immediately. And tell the other flight attendants to prepare for an emergency landing, but also tell them that we're going to make it safely." As Sarah walked toward the front of the plane, several other flight attendants saw her. 2 of them had also served in the military and recognized the famous pilot. They stood at attention as she passed, even in the middle of the emergency. Word spread quickly through the plane from the crew. This simple woman, that everyone had been making fun of and looking down on, was actually a decorated war hero and one of the most skilled pilots in American military history. In the small cockpit area, Captain Rodriguez and his young co-pilot Kim were working frantically with all the controls and switches. Rodriguez had been flying commercial airlines for 30 years, but he had never faced a situation where both engines were completely dead. The young co-pilot was clearly terrified and close to panic. "Captain Rodriguez," Jenny said as she entered the cockpit with Sarah right behind her. "This is Colonel Sarah Mitchell, call sign Viper. She's here to help us." Captain Rodriguez looked back over his shoulder, confused and stressed. "Ma'am, I appreciate any help, but this isn't a military fighter jet. This is a commercial passenger aircraft with different systems. We're dealing with a civilian emergency here." Sarah stepped forward confidently. "Captain, I have over 6,000 flight hours in military aircraft. I've flown F-16 Fighting Falcons, F-18 Super Hornets, and C-130 transport planes. But more importantly, I've landed damaged aircraft with no engines, no landing gear, and no hydraulic systems while being shot at by enemy forces. I've brought planes home that other pilots said were impossible to fly." She looked quickly at all the instruments, switches, and controls. Her trained eyes took in everything at once: altitude, speed, fuel levels, electrical systems, and hydraulic pressure. "Right now, Captain, you need my help, and these 127 people need both of us working together." Captain Rodriguez was desperate and willing to try anything. "What do you see that we're missing?" Sarah studied the instrument panel for 30 seconds, then pointed to several specific gauges. "You're trying to restart the engines using standard procedures, but that won't work in this situation. You have both fuel system problems and electrical system problems happening at the same time. The fuel isn't getting to the engines properly, and even if it was, the electrical ignition system is damaged." She continued, "But this aircraft can still fly and land safely. It's basically a glider now, but a very heavy glider. I can get us down using the plane's remaining speed, the wind currents, and emergency procedures that I learned in combat situations." "What do you need from us?" asked Captain Rodriguez. "Let me take the controls and call the nearest Air Force base immediately. Tell them that Viper is incoming with a disabled civilian aircraft and needs their longest runway cleared for an emergency landing." When Sarah took control of the airplane, the passengers throughout the cabin could feel the difference immediately. The scary, uncontrolled shaking and dropping sensation stopped. The plane was still descending without engine power, but now it felt smooth and controlled. It was like the difference between falling off a cliff and riding down a steep but manageable hill. Back in the passenger cabin, the businessman, rich woman, and college student sat in complete shock and disbelief. The woman they had spent 2 hours being cruel to and making fun of was now literally saving their lives and the lives of everyone on the plane. "I can't believe this," the businessman whispered to the student. "She's really a colonel. A real military fighter pilot. One of the best in the country." The rich woman felt physically sick with shame and regret. "We were so horrible to her for hours. We said terrible things. She could have told us who she was at any time, but she just sat there quietly and took all our insults." The student realized how foolish and arrogant he had been. "She probably knows more about airplanes and flying than all my professors put together. And I was trying to impress her with my basic engineering classes. I feel like such an idiot." Jenny made an announcement to all the passengers over the intercom system. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want you to know that Colonel Sarah Mitchell has taken control of our aircraft. She is one of the most famous and skilled pilots in United States military history. She has saved damaged aircraft in combat situations many times. We are in the best possible hands and we will land safely." This announcement calmed many of the panicked passengers. Parents hugged their children and told them that a real hero was flying their plane. People who had been crying started to feel hope again. In the cockpit, Sarah was performing what could only be described as a miracle of aviation. With no engine power at all, she was using the plane's remaining speed, wind patterns, and her incredible skill and experience to keep them in the air much longer than should have been physically possible. She got on the radio using her famous military call sign. "Control tower, this is Viper. I have a commercial passenger aircraft, 127 souls on board, both engines dead, requesting emergency landing at your facility." The voice that responded was filled with recognition and respect. "Viper, this is Colonel Hayes at Peterson Air Force Base. We all know your reputation, ma'am. Runway 09 is being cleared now, wind conditions are favorable, and all emergency crews are standing by. We're honored to have you bringing them home." "Don't need to be honored, Hayes. Just need your longest runway and your best emergency teams ready to go." Sarah began what would be the most difficult and important landing of her entire career. With no engine power, she had only one chance to get this right. If she came in too steep, the plane would hit the ground too hard and break apart. If she came in too shallow, they wouldn't reach the runway and would crash in the field before the airport. She had to judge the angle of descent, the wind speed and direction, the weight of the aircraft, and dozens of other factors perfectly. There was no room for any mistakes. The passengers could see the Air Force Base approaching through the windows. Emergency vehicles lined both sides of the runway: fire trucks, ambulances, and military personnel. Everyone on the ground was waiting and watching. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah announced calmly to everyone on the plane, "we are going to make a hard landing, but we are going to make it safely. Everyone stay in crash position with your heads down and seat belts tight until we come to a complete stop." The plane approached the runway at a steep angle. Sarah used every technique she had learned in 25 years of military flying to control the aircraft as it descended. She adjusted the wing flaps, controlled the rudder perfectly, and used the weight distribution to keep the plane stable. The aircraft hit the runway hard but straight and level. Sarah then used every method she knew to slow down the plane without engine power. She deployed all the wing flaps, used the wheel brakes carefully to avoid skidding, and even steered using the front nose wheel to keep them going straight down the center of the runway. The plane slid down the runway for what seemed like forever, but Sarah kept it under control the entire time. Finally, just 200 feet before the end of the runway, the aircraft came to a complete stop. For several seconds, nobody on the plane made any sound at all. Everyone was processing the fact that they were alive and safe on the ground. Then the entire aircraft erupted in cheering, clapping, and crying with relief and joy. Emergency crews surrounded the plane immediately. All 127 passengers and 6 crew members evacuated safely through the emergency slides. Not a single person was seriously injured. A few people had minor cuts and bruises, but everyone was alive and would go home to their families. As Sarah was the last person to leave the cockpit area, Captain Rodriguez grabbed both of her hands. "Colonel Mitchell, you just saved every single life on this plane. That was the most incredible piece of flying I have ever witnessed in 30 years of aviation. You are a true hero." Outside the aircraft, military personnel from the Air Force Base stood at attention when Sarah appeared. Word had spread throughout the base that the legendary Viper had just performed another impossible rescue. Colonels and generals who were stationed at the base came out to see the famous pilot who had just added another miraculous save to her already incredible record. But Sarah walked past all the saluting military officers and went straight to the group of passengers she had been sitting with on the plane. The businessman, rich woman, college student, and the woman's daughter stood together in a small group, looking deeply ashamed of their earlier behavior. "Ma'am," the businessman began, his voice shaking with emotion. "We owe you our lives. Literally. And we need to apologize. We were terrible people to you. We said horrible things and made awful assumptions." The rich woman had tears streaming down her face. "Colonel Mitchell, I am so deeply sorry. We judged you by your clothes and appearance and decided you were beneath us. We were cruel and mean. Then you saved all of us after we treated you so badly. I don't know how to make up for what we did." The college student could barely get the words out. "Ma'am, I was showing off about studying aerospace engineering and you're a real combat pilot. A war hero. I was trying to impress you with knowledge you forgot more about than I'll ever learn. I feel so ashamed and stupid." The teenage daughter spoke up for the first time. "Colonel, my mom taught me that we're better than other people because we have money. But you showed me that real worth comes from what you can do to help others, not what you own." Sarah looked at each of them with calm, steady eyes. "You know what I learned during my 25 years in the military? Never judge any person by how they look, what they wear, or what you think you know about them. Some of the bravest soldiers I ever served with came from small towns and poor families. Some of the smartest people I ever met never went to fancy colleges. And some of the richest people in terms of character and heart had very little money in their bank accounts." She paused and continued, "I don't dress to impress strangers at airports. I don't wear my medals to the grocery store. I don't carry my military records around to prove my worth to people who don't know me. But when people's lives are in danger, when someone needs help, then I step up and do whatever I can. That's what real service means." The businessman looked down at his expensive shoes. "We learned something very important today, Colonel. Something we should have known all our lives." The rich woman nodded through her tears. "My daughter will remember this day for the rest of her life. We all will. You taught us about real character and dignity." Sarah's expression softened slightly. "Then maybe something positive came out of a dangerous and frightening situation. Maybe you'll think twice before judging the next person you meet." A young newspaper reporter who had heard about the emergency landing arrived at the Air Force Base and approached Sarah. "Colonel Mitchell, can you tell our readers about your military service? I understand you're quite well known in aviation circles." Sarah thought for a moment, then answered carefully. "I served my country in the United States Air Force for 25 years. I flew combat missions in Iraq, Afghanistan, and several other places that I'm not allowed to discuss. I led fighter squadrons, trained new pilots, and yes, I was fortunate enough to save some lives along the way. But today wasn't about my military record or my past achievements. Today was simply about getting 127 people home safely to their families." "What do you do now that you're retired from military service?" "I live quietly in a small town in Montana. I have a little house with a big garden where I grow vegetables and flowers. I have 2 dogs, a golden retriever named Charlie and a mixed breed named Lucy. I read books, watch old movies, take long walks in the mountains and live a peaceful, simple life. And I genuinely like it that way." The reporter seemed surprised. "But surely someone with your incredible background and skills could be doing something more significant? More important." Sarah glanced over at the group of passengers who had spent hours making fun of her, then looked back at the reporter with a small smile. "Young man, there is absolutely nothing more important than being content with who you are and what you've accomplished. I don't need to prove my worth or value to strangers. I know what I've done, what I've sacrificed, and what I'm capable of when it matters. That knowledge is enough for me." As the passengers were loaded onto buses to continue their interrupted journey, many of them came over to personally shake Sarah's hand and thank her. Word was already spreading on social media and news outlets about what was being called the miracle landing by the quiet hero. The businessman made a decision that surprised everyone, including himself. He canceled his $50 million business meeting in Denver and instead flew home to spend the weekend with his wife and children. He realized that making money wasn't the most important thing in life. The rich woman donated a substantial amount of money to several veterans organizations and started volunteering at a local charity that helped military families. She also had a long, serious conversation with her daughter about treating all people with respect and dignity. The college student changed his major from aerospace engineering to aviation safety research. He was inspired by Sarah's example of using knowledge and skill to save lives rather than just to make money or gain recognition. Jenny, the flight attendant, stayed in touch with Sarah and visited her in Montana several months later. "Colonel," she said during that visit, "you showed me something important that day. Real strength and real heroism don't need to announce themselves or show off." Sarah returned to her quiet, peaceful life in the mountains of Montana, but she carried with her the satisfaction of knowing that she had made a difference when it mattered most. She had spent 2 hours being insulted and looked down upon, then had saved the lives of every person who had been cruel to her. 6 months later, Sarah received a handwritten letter from Madison, the rich woman's teenage daughter. The girl had written a school essay about her experience called, "Don't Judge a Book by Its Cover: The Day I Met a Real Hero." In the essay, Madison wrote, "I learned that real heroes don't walk around wearing special clothes or uniforms when they're not working. They shop at regular stores, read regular books, and look like completely normal people. But when someone needs help, when lives are in danger, they step up with amazing skill, courage, and grace. The woman my mother and I made fun of turned out to be one of the greatest pilots in our country's history. She could have been angry at us, but instead she saved our lives and taught us the most important lesson we'd ever learned about treating people with kindness and respect." Sarah smiled when she read the letter. She put it in a special box in her kitchen drawer next to other letters from people whose lives she had touched over the years, letters from soldiers she had trained, from pilots she had rescued, and from families she had helped in various ways. Then she went back to her garden, where she was planting tomatoes and reading a good book about the history of aviation. Her 2 dogs lay in the shade nearby, and the Montana mountains stretched out beautifully in the distance. Sometimes the greatest heroes are hiding in plain sight, living simple lives, wearing ordinary clothes, and doing everyday things. They don't need constant recognition or praise from strangers. They don't need to prove themselves to people who judge by appearances. They just need to be ready when the moment comes to make a real difference in the world. Colonel Sarah Viper Mitchell understood this truth better than anyone. She had saved 127 lives that day, but more importantly, she had taught an unforgettable lesson about respect, humility, kindness, and the serious danger of judging other people by how they look or what they own. The passengers on that flight never forgot their encounter with true greatness disguised as ordinary simplicity. And Sarah never forgot that sometimes the most important teaching moments come from the most unexpected and challenging situations. In a world full of people trying to impress others with their money, education, expensive possessions, or job titles, Sarah had shown them something completely different and far more valuable: the quiet dignity of a person who knows their own worth and doesn't need to prove it to anyone else. That's what makes a person a true hero: not the uniform, not the medals, not the recognition, but the character to do the right thing when it matters most, especially for people who haven't treated you well. And sometimes that's the most important lesson of all.